London and Dublin. In less than 2 years, Ireland would be granted home rule in law, then denied it in practice. Politicians would promise compromise, communities would prepare for conflict, and the argument would shift from speeches to rifles. The simple version says this was a constitutional dispute. The real version is harsher. This was a crisis of trust, where each side believed the other might use force first, and where delay felt like defeat. In this episode, we follow 3 threads. First, why confrontation became nearly inevitable after the Third Home Rule Bill appeared in 1912. Second, the turning point most summaries skip, when constitutional authority stopped looking fully enforceable. Third, how the years before 1916 built the emotional and political machinery for a much bigger rupture. Before any barricades, the pressure was already there. The British Liberal government depended on Irish parliamentary support. The old Lord's veto was weakened. So when the Third Home Rule Bill was introduced, Irish nationalists saw a long-awaited breakthrough. But many Unionists, especially in Ulster, saw a future they feared: rule from Dublin by a parliament they did not trust. That is the key to this whole episode. Both camps believed they were defending survival, not just winning an argument. Nationalists thought another delay would bury constitutional reform for a generation. Unionists thought acceptance would lock them into a permanent political minority. London wanted to pass legislation without triggering civil conflict, and that triangle, fear, urgency, and limited trust, made every compromise look temporary. By late 1912, the conflict had already left the chamber and entered the street. The famous signatures on the Ulster Covenant were not only symbolic, they were a declaration that resistance would be organized, public, and sustained. In response, nationalists began to ask a terrifying question. If one side can mobilize outside Parliament, can Parliament alone still decide the outcome? And once that question is asked, politics changes shape.
Now the story accelerates. On one side stood leaders of constitutional nationalism, still committed to parliamentary strategy, still betting that pressure in Westminster could deliver real self-government. On the other stood Unionist leadership in Ulster, disciplined, strategic, and increasingly convinced that mass resistance was both legitimate and necessary. Over them sat a British government trying to hold legal authority together while the social ground shifted beneath it. This was not a duel of heroes. It was a duel of bad options. If nationalists waited quietly, they risked endless postponement. If Unionists accepted home rule, they feared irreversible loss of control. If London enforced policy too aggressively, it might ignite the very violence it claimed to prevent. Then came organization. In 1913, Unionist resistance hardened into a paramilitary structure through the Ulster Volunteer Force. That mattered because capability is different from rhetoric. Once command, drilling, and logistics appear, politics no longer runs only on persuasion. It runs on credible threat. Nationalists answered with their own mobilization. The Irish Volunteers emerged later in 1913, partly as a balancing force and partly as a warning that one-sided coercive power would not go unanswered. Ireland now had rival movements, rival loyalties, and rival claims to legitimacy, all growing in parallel. And then came the moment many people miss when telling this story: the Curragh incident in March 1914. British Army officers indicated they would resist action against Ulster Unionists. Whether read as mutiny, misunderstanding, or political panic, the effect was immediate. Nationalists saw a state that might pass a law but hesitate to enforce it. Unionists saw proof that resistance worked. Confidence in neutral enforcement cracked. From that point onward, each side stopped treating force as hypothetical. Planning became practical. The question was no longer simply who is right, it became who can hold ground if compromise fails. Once politics reaches that stage, every new shock multiplies the risk. Spring and summer 1914 turned risk into reality. At Larne in April, large quantities of weapons were landed for Unionist volunteers in a carefully planned operation. The message was unmistakable. Resistance was not theatrical, it was armed. Nationalists drew the obvious conclusion. If one side can import rifles, the other side cannot remain unarmed without accepting strategic weakness. In July, the Howth gun-running brought another dramatic image, volunteers landing arms for nationalist forces near Dublin. Crowds gathered, tension rose, and later that day at Bachelor's Walk, troops fired on civilians. People were killed, many more were injured, and the emotional temperature changed again. For ordinary families, this was no longer abstract constitutional debate. It was fear in the street, funerals, and rage. Meanwhile, London still searched for a formula to prevent collapse. Conferences were held, proposals were floated, including temporary exclusions and conditional arrangements. None produced a settlement both sides could accept. Every draft looked, to someone, like surrender. Then Europe detonated. In August 1914, Britain entered a continental war that immediately reordered priorities. In September, the Home Rule Act received royal assent. On paper, nationalists had won the central constitutional prize, but implementation was suspended for the duration of the war. That single combination, passage and postponement, created a political paradox that satisfied almost nobody. Unionists had demonstrated the power of organized resistance. Constitutional nationalists had secured law without immediate delivery. More radical currents drew their own lesson. If the imperial system can defer a past settlement under pressure, then pressure becomes central to politics. This is where the seed of the next phase is planted. A generation now watched institutions promise, delay, and improvise, while armed organizations grew in legitimacy at community level. Even people who wanted peace began to think in terms of preparedness. Even people who favored compromise began to expect betrayal. The clock did not stop in September 1914. It just started ticking louder under wartime silence. So, what was the real turning point in 1912 to 1914? Not one speech, not one riot, not one shipment of rifles. It was the sequence: mass political pledges, paramilitary structure, doubts about state enforcement, reciprocal arming, then legal victory, suspended by war. Step by step, constitutional authority lost credibility faster than it could produce trust. Most short retellings say this period proves one side was more militant. The deeper truth is that the center failed to convince either side it could guarantee a stable outcome. And when that happens, communities stop betting on procedure alone. They hedge, organize, and prepare. The human cost is easy to flatten if we focus only on famous names, but this crisis lived in ordinary homes, families split by allegiance, workers under pressure from rival organizations, civilians caught between marches and patrols, neighborhoods learning to read rumor as survival information. Victory from far away looked like legislative milestones. Up close, it felt like uncertainty with uniforms. Why does this episode still matter? Because it shows a timeless political lesson. If a state cannot clearly implement its own settlement, non-state actors gain leverage fast. And if both sides believe delay favors the other, compromise shrinks with every month. By the time Ireland reaches 1916, the stage is already built. distrust of delay, normalization of volunteer structures, and a population primed to interpret force through the language of legitimacy. That is why later events moved so quickly. They did not appear from nowhere. They emerged from this fuse being lit, inch by inch, from bill to covenant, from conference to rifle, from law to suspension. The battle in this episode ends with a paradox. Home rule passed, home rule paused. One side called that prudence, another called it betrayal, and from that argument came the next chapter. Next, Easter week 1916, the rising that failed militarily, transformed politics, and changed the future of Irish independence.